Hello, and welcome to more history stuff. So this is the second video that I'm making about the mysterious circumstances of the death of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, in December 1282. In the last video, if you watched that, I went over the first in a series of correspondence, a series of letters that were written by John Pecham, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the immediate aftermath of Llywelyn's death on the 11th of December 1282. These letters were probably written within just a couple of days of the event, as soon as Peckham heard of it. And the first one, which I discussed in the last video, was sent directly to the King, Edward I. And the second one, which was probably written and dispatched on the same day, or soon afterwards, was written to Robert Burnell, the Lord Chancellor and Edward's closest advisor. Now, this letter is actually more detailed than the one Peckham sent direct to the King, which is interesting because you'd think that Peckham would send the longer version of events to the King, but instead he sends it to Burnell, which says quite a lot, really. It says a lot about Burnell's importance. He was a sort of 13th century Cardinal Wolsey figure, certainly very influential, very powerful, very capable. Edward trusted him like he trusted very few other men, no one really. He's a very interesting character, and would have also known a great deal about the events and the background of events in Wales, because he was from Shropshire, Acton Burnell in Shropshire, very near the border of Wales. So he would have been very familiar with Llywelyn and the situation in Wales, what was going on. So it's quite a long letter, so I'll read out the relevant part. Here we go. Brother John to Bishop Robert of Bath and Wells. Because of things that are discerned to have a tendency to cause injury and danger to the Lord our King, he is responsible to uncover it faithfully to anyone at all, and keep nothing hidden to himself. And it is our most profound desire, ours among others, to keep his honour and greatness safe from the treachery of enemies. We send to you some document enclosed with these. Indeed, it is made in obscure words and names, which is copied, which the Lord Edmund Mortimer has discovered in the belt of Llywelyn, once Prince of Wales, together with his small seal, which to keep safe we hold in our keeping, to be sent to the Lord King if he desires. From which document you will be able to adequately conclude that certain magnates neighbouring the Welsh, either marchers or others, are not uniformly well enough disposed to the King. You may narrate about this to the Lord King, in order that he makes ready. Thus, nevertheless, as it is that so many of our men and your men are involved, let no danger thence come forth to your body, and of this you should anxiously beware. And then the letter goes on to discuss other matters. But this, in combination with the first letter, which I described in the last video, is very intriguing. Peckham has actually expressed here a fear that he didn't directly express in his letter to Edward. He's saying to Burnell, from the coded letter that was found on Llywelyn's body, which contains certain obscure words and names, which sounds as if this letter contains a series of names of individuals that are being hidden under code names. From this document, Burnell will be able to conclude that certain magnates, certain lords neighbouring the Welsh, either marchers or others, so marcher lords and others, are not well disposed to the King. And then towards the end, he warns Burnell to look to his own safety. Let no danger come forth to your body, and of this you should anxiously beware. So this casts a very different and even a much darker light on the affair of Llywelyn's death. As I said in my last video repeatedly, because it's got to be borne in mind to understand the nature of this material, this series of letters is high-level correspondence meant to be read by a very small number of very powerful individuals, namely the King, Peckham himself of course, and the Chancellor. And that's it. Nobody else is meant to read this stuff. We can, of course, 700 years later, because it happens to have survived. But at the time, this is top-level, high-security correspondence. And what Peckham is actually saying in these two letters is that Llywelyn has been killed by the Marchers, principally the Mortimers. The involvement of Edmund Mortimer and his brother Roger is beyond doubt. But this is not something to be celebrated. Neither of these letters have any sense of sort of victory or triumph in them. They're quite paranoid, they're quite edgy. And in his first letter to the King, Peckham hinted at something else, something dark and conspiratorial going on. But then he outright states it in his letter to Burnell. He says that the Marchers have destroyed Llywelyn, but that doesn't mean they're loyal to us, to the King, and that we should be wary of them. That's essentially what he's implying, is that the King might be next. The Mortimers and their allies have killed Llywelyn, and Edward could well be next in line for the chop. So what we can glean from this is that the plot to kill Llywelyn was very much a Marcher conspiracy. And the Marcher lords were a power unto themselves, really. The King's writ didn't really run in the Marches, and it was almost like a semi-independent state sandwiched between England and Wales. So it's quite credible that they could have chosen to act independently. I mean, Edward is at war with Llywelyn, of course, and he will want Llywelyn dead. Or would he? Because if you look at what Edward does to his enemies in other circumstances, he's quite capable of laying traps for his enemies. He does so on several occasions. But generally what he wants is for them to be captured and then handed over to him so he can pass sentence on them. This happens to William Wallace, of course, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, Madog ap Llywelyn, various others, Rhys ap Meredydd. And in my opinion, this is my interpretation of these documents, this material, Edward would have wanted his men to capture Llywelyn and then send him to the King, so the King could pass judgment on him. And this is important because what Edward wants is for everything to proceed according to his authority, according to his direct power and judgment. And you can see this in the treatment of several other Welsh princes during this war. Some of Llywelyn's allies, people like Rhys Wynod and the brothers Gruffudd and Cynan ap Meredydd, when they're captured, they're sent to Edward at Rhuddlan, and he sentences them to prison for a few years. Doesn't kill them, they're put in prison and then later on released in exchange for military service. And while these men are of lesser status than Llywelyn, he's the Prince of Wales, whilst they're lords of individual territories, you can see that this is Edward's policy. He's got to be in charge. And what has happened in the case of Llywelyn is that the Marchers, led by the Mortimer brothers, have taken affairs into their own hands, and it looks like they've killed Llywelyn without waiting for Edward's orders. They haven't done it on his command, on his instruction. And this is what has rattled Peckham. This is what has got him worried. because this kind of independence of action is potentially threatening. I mean, the Marchers are very powerful in military terms, and if they decide to band together and attack the Prince of Wales or the King of England, they can cause a lot of trouble. And they've behaved in this sort of way before. In the 1260s, for instance, they attacked Simon de Montfort when he was briefly in charge of England, and he had to wage several campaigns to put them down again. And a lot of the men involved in the death of Llywelyn, just about 16 years later, they are the same men. They are the same sort of violent, ambitious, very independently minded, powerful noblemen. They're used to violence to get their way. This is how they operate, because the Marches is a very unruly, war-torn area, and these men are raised in this environment. This is how they understand the exercise of power and how things get done. It's done via warfare and military means and conspiracy. And this is what they've done. And I do think that this evidence, along with all the other evidence for Llywelyn's death, has been misinterpreted in the past. There's a tendency to overrate Edward's importance. Edward is perceived as this all-powerful figure who's controlling everything, like some kind of invincible puppet master, that everyone is just dancing to his tune. Well, while Edward was a very sort of strong-willed, domineering personality, that doesn't mean he was capable of controlling everything, or that he wasn't surrounded by men of equal ambition and belligerence who were perfectly capable of pursuing their own interests. And that is very much the case here. Because if Peckham wasn't worried about the threat from the Marchers, and he wasn't disturbed by what they had done to Llywelyn and the potential threat that implied to the king, then why would he express such fears in these personal letters to the king and the chancellor? It doesn't make sense. So my personal interpretation, and I don't think it's an unreasonable one, is that the death of Llywelyn was ultimately the result of a conspiracy among the Marcher lords. And this letter, this coded letter made in obscure words and names that Peckham describes, that's very interesting. If only a copy of it had survived so we could have a look at it. But apparently it hasn't. And you can understand why. You would imagine that the original and the copy were destroyed pretty quickly, because this is, this would be quite dangerous evidence to keep lying around. So yeah, that's my conclusion. And I mean, you could, there's a lot more to be said about that and the consequences of this event and the main players involved and their relationships afterwards and how it affects the balance of power in England and Wales. But I can't obviously discuss all that in one video. I'll keep this relatively short because I just want to get this main point across. If you look at these letters, which are absolutely the best evidence that we've got as it stands for the death of Llywelyn, this is very much a conspiracy, a plot among the Marcher lords led by the Mortimer brothers. And it very much looks like the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, and even the King didn't know very much about it and were threatened by it, which I think is quite a different interpretation than has been put forward before. And I think the evidence justifies it. So there we go. I might discuss related matters in other videos, but that's all I've got for now. I hope you find it interesting. And I'll hopefully speak to you again later. Thank you.